So I would like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. And I pay my respect to elders past and present. I recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, and I acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living today. And the research I will talk about took place on Wiradjuri country, and I respectfully acknowledge the Wiradjuri people who are the traditional owners and custodians of the land. I would also like to acknowledge my colleagues who were part of this project and our project partners, and I express my gratitude for the individuals who participated in interviews for this research. I will begin with a few words about the context of this research. One of the great challenges for regional refugee resettlement is the issue of attraction and retention. And that's, of course, the two key questions. Why should refugees come to a particular community and why should they stay? And then often if refugees eventually move away from the region, this is considered a policy failure. In this presentation, I argue that the issue of regional refugee resettlement and retention is more complex, and I draw on the case study of the Hazara in Leeton, New South Wales. I will explore the reasons that have attracted the Hazara to Leeton and that have often motivated them to stay in Leeton for many years. And I will also explore their challenges and the reasons why some of them have eventually left Leeton and have moved on to a larger city. And I will argue in this presentation that Leeton has been a place for the Hazara to find their feet and that both the Hazara and the community in Leeton have benefited. A few words about the research that I'm drawing on. So this presentation draws on a research project that explored the impact of refugee resettlement in regional Australia, and the case study was Leeton in New South Wales. As you can see on the map, Leeton is about a 1.5 hour drive from Wagga Wagga, and the Leeton Shire has a population of about 11,000 people. A few words about the Hazara community in Leeton. Our conversations with key stakeholders suggest that some years ago, there were about 200 Hazara in Leeton and the neighbouring town of Griffith, and the current estimate is that around 40 Hazara remain in Leeton, including four families and several unaccompanied men. For the data collection, we were able to visit Leeton at the end of last year in November, in between various lockdowns and COVID restrictions. And we were able to conduct semi-structured in-depth interviews with 7 Hazara in Leeton and 8 non-Hazara. So in the first part of this presentation, I will share with you our findings of the main reasons of the Hazara for moving to Leeton that emerged from the interviews with the Hazara and the non-Hazara participants. You can see those main reasons on the slide now. And of course, existing literature supports these findings, the key benefits of refugees living in regional areas, and you can see some of those earlier studies. I've included them on the slide. Because of a lack of time, I can't explore each of these reasons for moving and staying to Leeton in depth, but I will say a few words about those reasons over the next few slides. So the Hazara men we interviewed for this research arrived in Leeton through secondary migration after initially settling in a capital city. The men had lived in the capital city for periods between a few months to up to 2 or 3 years before their move to Leeton. The men had learned about employment opportunities in Leeton through their networks. Some initially settled in the neighbouring town of Griffith and later moved to Leeton. One example to illustrate this is Hazara man Numan, who participated in an interview for this project. Numan is aged in his 40s. He's a husband, a father of 5 and a meat worker. And Numan arrived in Melbourne in 2011. When Numan couldn't find work in Melbourne for 6 months, he moved to Griffith and then to Leeton, where he had found work at a local meatworks through his community. And then in 2019, his family joined Numan in Leeton from Afghanistan. For one of the Hazara participants, Danesh, it was his visa requirements that motivated him to move to Leeton. So Danesh was on a chef visa and he first moved to Leeton in 2017 to meet the regional employment requirements to become eligible for a permanent visa. For Danesh, this has been challenging because of his age. He's in his late 50s. He's often rejected for jobs that are considered physically demanding. And while he was offered cash in hand jobs, he couldn't accept them because he needs a record of his employment for his visa. And as a result, he engages in seasonal work and moves over large distances between multiple cities and town, always chasing new work. For the participants in this research, employment was the main reason that attracted them to Leeton. Danesh, like I just explained, was motivated by the requirements of his chef visa, but there were then also several other factors that made the participants enjoy living in Leeton, and these factors have kept them there often for many years, and I will briefly talk about those factors over the next few slides. So I don't have enough time to discuss in detail what the participants said about the country lifestyle and affordability, but of course that was a key factor that made them enjoy life in Leeton. But what I do want to briefly say is that the Hazara liked the slower pace in Leeton compared to the major cities, and except for seasonal worker Danesh, who I just spoke about, the Hazara individuals and families that we did interview had purchased their own houses in Leeton, and of course that's a significant commitment to living in Leeton for the longer term. A prominent theme were the Hazara participants' experiences of acceptance and belonging in Leeton. In the first quote on the slide, Hazara man Rafiq states that he feels comfortable and respected in Leeton, and it is evident in the second quote that the Hazara are valued for their work ethic. They're seen as good people in quotation marks, and their contributions to the town are recognised. Again, I won't have much time to speak in great detail about the availability of support. That was another reason that made living in Leeton a very positive experience for the Hazara, and it was a key theme that came up in the interviews. But what I would like to briefly acknowledge is that both the Hazara and the non-Hazara highlighted that there was extensive support for the Hazara community through, for example, the council and the Leeton Multicultural Support Group, and that this played an important role in their experiences of living in Leeton. And of course, this morning, my colleague David Radford talked about the availability of support. So hopefully many of you have been able to listen to David's presentation this morning. A final theme about Hazara community's positive experiences in Leeton was their sense that they were able to contribute. The Hazara and non-Hazara participants stated that the Hazara community have contributed through their employment and through their educational achievements. For example, Rafiq's quote on the slide shows that through their employment, the Hazara have contributed to the expansion of several businesses in Leeton. And a common observation was also that the Hazara have taken on work that is less desirable to other long-term residents. And then also, in addition to their contributions through employment and education, others also spoke about the contributions of the Hazara to the social and cultural life of Leeton. And a key example was that the Hazara shared their food at community events. So David this morning spoke about, for example, Harmony Day and the Chill and Grill events. I will now move on to the challenges experienced by the Hazara in Leeton and some of the reasons that have motivated them to move away from the town, often after having lived in Leeton for many years. The Hazara in Leeton experienced many of the challenges that newly arrived refugees face all over Australia, and those challenges are well known in the literature. And again, I've included some of those references on the slide. These challenges include some element of racism or discriminatory practices, limited specialised services for migrants and refugees, and challenges around housing and transport. However, those challenges didn't emerge as prominent themes in the interviews. And I've included those main challenges that were important in the interviews on the slide, and I will now briefly talk you through those challenges. The main reason for leaving Leeton was a lack of tertiary education. Even though Wagga Wagga, which is a 1.5-hour car trip away from Leeton, does have a university, this was not seen as an option for the Hazara that we did interview, and most identified a need to move to a capital city once their oldest child completed high school. The two quotes by Moran and Rafiq show that while the parents make decisions for the family while the children are younger, once the children are older, it is the children's need, and in that case, their need to access tertiary education, that becomes the priority for the family, and the parents move to a capital city to enable their children's university education. Another challenge included a lack of employment and business opportunities. Numan's quote shows that the lack of job opportunities is a concern for him, especially because he is aware that he cannot do physically demanding work once he is older. Others commented that it is much more difficult to set up a business in a small town like Leeton, and this is a challenge for the Hazara, who are well known for their entrepreneurialism. And for example, Collins and colleagues have written about this. The limited employment opportunities also affected the women. For example, Numan's wife Anis has commented in the interview that if they lived in a city with a more significant Hazara community, she would be able to work as a seamstress for the Hazara community to contribute to the family income. Another key challenge was a feeling of social and cultural isolation. This derived from the small number of Hazara in Leeton, and many expressed a concern that more families will eventually leave Leeton once their children reach university age. This limited their social circle and sometimes affected their ability to engage in cultural celebrations. Especially the parent generation, who faced more significant language barriers, found it more difficult to connect with the non-Hazara residents of Leeton. Some also observed that they lacked the facilities in Leeton to practice their culture and religion, although they did acknowledge that the community tries to accommodate them. Another challenge in this respect was lack of access to culturally specific food, and often Afghan bread was mentioned as an example, which is not available in Leeton. Again, because of lack of time, I cannot speak about the challenges around citizenship and family reunion in great detail, but I do want to acknowledge the immense challenges faced by refugees and asylum seekers all over Australia who wait for many years to gain their citizenship and who are separated from their families for very long periods of time. This challenge is not specific to Leeton, but it did, of course, also affect the Hazara participants in this research. So I explained at the start, we conducted those interviews in November last year, where it came up as an issue, and I can only imagine that this concern is now even more pressing this year for those Hazara who have family in Afghanistan. So while it was initially employment that attracted the Hazara to Leeton, and for some like Danesh, their visa requirements brought them to Leeton initially, there are many factors that keep them in Leeton for many years, including the country lifestyle and affordability, a feeling of belonging, acceptance, and being able to contribute, and the availability of support. The first quote that you can see on the slide supports these findings, with a volunteer from the Leeton Multicultural Support Group suggesting that these factors create a sense of being at home in Leeton. However, the second quote also shows that once the family has settled into their lives in Australia, or the term I use in this presentation, once they have found their feet, they often choose to leave Leeton to move to a larger city. As the previous slides have shown, the lives of the Hazara in Leeton are not without challenges, and as the declining numbers show, many have chosen to move away, often after spending many years in Leeton. And I also do want to acknowledge that the voices of those who have lived in Leeton and who have since left Leeton are currently missing from this research, and it's important to hear their voices, and we are beginning to extend our research with further interviews. Some conclusions: the departure of some Hazara from Leeton should not be considered as failed settlement. Instead, Leeton has provided a place to find their feet, which has allowed the Hazara to develop social and human capital, including employment experience, language skills, and financial savings. Other research recognises the benefits for refugees who live in regional towns. For example, two 2019 reports by the Regional Australia Institute and by the Commonwealth of Australia, and also the two reports by AIMS Australia and Deloitte on the Karen, Neil and Bendigo. Leeton has equally gained from the presence of the Hazara, as the Hazara have filled job vacancies, their children have attended local schools, and they have contributed to the social and cultural life of Leeton. And again, the reports I just mentioned also recognise the benefits of refugee resettlement for regional towns. So we argue that while some of the main challenges in this case, the Hazara in Leeton, need to be addressed, regional towns should be conceptualised and promoted as temporary homes, as well as long-term or permanent homes for refugee families, with gains for both the town and the Hazara community. Thank you.
Thank you, Heidi. That was brilliant. I think there's going to be some connections with what I'm going to talk about later, but and possibly with Anthony and Martina as well. So yeah, we'll hold the questions to later, like I promised. I want to ask questions now, but we'll wait. So Martina, over to you.
Thanks, George, and thanks to you and all your co-organisers for bringing us together today. It's been a really great day already, and I hope we can add something to all the great insights that have already been shared. So I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land from which I'm zooming in today, and also the Yorta people as the traditional custodians of the land on which our research has taken place. The land has never been ceded. In today's presentation, and I hope I can move on. It doesn't let me move on. Oh dear. Sorry, it doesn't let me move on to the next slide, which is unfortunate.
Sorry, Martina, would you like me to share a screen for you?
Maybe if I can, sorry, I need to get out of this view now. Okay. If I can share I've also got the PowerPoints here, so I can share them. That might be. Working. Can you see that now? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's working. Okay.
Great.
So yeah, in today's presentation, we present findings from a project on employment and mobility pathways in a regional Victorian town. And our research question in this project was how spatial and social mobilities of former refugees and migrants in regional Australia relate to each other and shape each other. Social mobility is understood as individual level change in socioeconomic circumstances and its direction. Now, based on the findings from this project and ongoing research, we extend this question in this presentation to ask, how can refugee settlement be understood in the context of border policy agendas aimed at directing migrants and refugees to regional areas? And we draw here on two papers that we've published this year, one in a special issue on regional migration and social frontiers, and another one in the British Journal of Sociology. So this is what we're planning to do today. So I'll start by briefly describing the research site, the method and sample. I'll then interrogate prevalent assumptions about spatial mobilities and social mobility in the research literature before highlighting the policy contexts that shape regional settlement. And then I'll hand over to Anthony, who will examine participants' perspectives on mobilities and in particular highlight the complex connections between spatial mobilities and social mobility. Understood not just as an economic phenomenon, but as a subjective lived experience. And he'll draw some conclusions. Now, the research on which the presentation is primarily based was funded through a La Trobe grant, was conducted in 2016-17 and built on research on migration, migrant settlement, refugee settlement, and multiculturalism in regional Australia, respectively, that each of us had conducted prior to them. And we selected a southeastern Australian regional town as our research site because it has a long history of cultural diverse migration, mainly related to its agricultural and horticultural sector. And we did not focus exclusively on former refugees, but included participants from a range of migration as well as ethnic backgrounds, including people who had arrived as refugees, but also some who had arrived as asylum seekers, as temporary skilled or as working holiday visa holders, all resident at that point in the town we called rural town. And so over several months, we interviewed 18 former refugees and migrants, 10 stakeholders whose work was related to migrants and refugees as service and education providers, businesses, local government and community sector representatives. And we asked the participants about their geographical moves and their outcomes, their mobility motivations and their aspirations in conjunction with their employment pathways. And we interviewed stakeholders, some of them also former migrants and refugees, about their perspectives on mobility and employment patterns, barriers and opportunities. Now, the bodies of literature that we engaged with and we aim to bring into conversation in this research were on the one hand scholarship on settlement and studies of mobility, and on the other hand studies of social mobility and of spatial mobility. Now, research on settlement and mobility has developed largely in isolation from each other and even in opposition to each other. So with recent scholarship on mobility is often positioned as a response to outdated sedentary social science perspectives on ongoing settlement. And while sociological conceptions differ from bureaucratic definitions of settlement regarding the length, the dimensions and the interpretations of what settlement success might be, there is a shared understanding of settlement as a place-based, as a relational process that occurs post-arrival over a finite period of time. Residential movements have not played a critical part in this research on settlement, beyond the question of attraction to and retention in specific locations, particularly in relation to regional settlement. Now, internal residential movements of labour migrants have, on the other hand, been studied by human geographers, labour geographers in particular, as well as demographers and more recently mobility scholars who have dealt in more detail with the question of immobility and practices of mobility and immobility. Now, in a paper that was published in James last year, we argue that bringing these bodies of scholarship and conversation, we're also able to better understand what actually happens in people's lives post-arrival in a destination country. So we argue for an advancement of the concept of settlement that includes movement and mobility as an imminent part of the post-arrival journeys of new entrants. Now, the other sort of pair of scholarship that that we tried to engage with in this research was the pair of spatial and social mobility. While aspirations for social mobility have long been understood as a motive for spatial mobilities, whether international migrants or international migrant movements, for either migrants themselves or for their descendants, social mobility has not actually received much attention in relation to former refugees. However, it is widely accepted, as we also hear today, that paid work, employment, and other economic opportunities are considered core dimensions of refugee settlement pathways, a condition and a consequence of successful settlement. Research on former refugees' secondary movements to regional Australia further indicates that employment opportunities are an important pull factor to regional Victoria. However, how these movements relate to medium and long-term social mobility beyond quick matches with low-skilled work, for example, in meatworks and horticulture, has not really been asked. Our aim in the research was to develop a richer account of subjective experiences of social mobility by analysing migrants' narratives about their geographical movements and employment pathways after arriving in Australia. Along with others who draw attention to the qualitative experience of social mobility, we examine the ways in which subjective experiences and appropriations of both social and spatial mobility are negotiated alongside each other and alongside other priorities and changes in people's lives. And one concept that is potentially useful in doing that is the concept of motility, which speaks to both capacities to move spatially and socially, as well as actual past or present moves. But this concept has primarily been applied to explain spatial mobility rather than social mobility. Now, before handing over to Anthony to speak about the interview findings, I'd like to draw attention to the broader policy context of regional settlements, which was also highlighted in the opening panel. Not only former refugees are increasingly drawn to regional towns by federal and partly also local level government initiatives, but at the same time, different sets of policies are aimed at attracting different groups of migrants to regional towns, from temporary skilled migrants that are tied to regional employer sponsors, to working holiday visa holders and seasonal labour migrants. Now, while only the first row here appears to be relevant for the purposes of this forum, the employment experiences of regional refugee settlement are potentially and actually shaped by some of the outcomes of the parallel, primarily economically motivated policies that attract mobile labour to the same low-wage, entry-level labour in regional locations that former refugees are accessing. Important to note here, there are a couple of points that set recognised refugees apart from other groups targeted by regional migration policies, namely the permanent residency right, and of course, that is with the exception of TPV and chef visa holders, and the freedom of movement, which also working holidaymakers enjoy, but not employer-tied seasonal workers or temporary skilled visa holders. It is the combination of these regulation features that makes former refugees a group whose settlement trajectories are more than any other group potentially shaped by local level policies. And I think this has come clearly out in a few presentations today. So the really important role of the local government. And these include also multi-interculturalism policies, of which there's an increasing number at the local government level in Victoria and beyond. Now, these are aimed at making places welcoming, ensuring equity and access for culturally diverse community members, and improving intercultural relations. Even locations without formal multicultural policies, a place identity that is shaped by diverse migration flows through refugee settlement and or other population movements is a social force that shapes the local experience of former refugees as well as other migrants or migrants with other migration trajectories. And I hand over here to Anthony.
Forgot to unmute. Thanks, Martina. I'd just quickly pay my respects to the elders past and present of the Bunurong, Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung peoples from the lands at which I'm now speaking in Melbourne. So on this slide, you see some quotes from interviews with Kual, originally from South Sudan, Afshan from Afghanistan, and Selma from Iraq. These quotes speak to their perspectives on possible motives for moving elsewhere, or indeed lacking motives for moving elsewhere. Kual, aged in his late 30s and a humanitarian migrant from South Sudan, works as a labourer. He's moved several times during his 13 years in Australia, and he felt that given his socio-economic position, life would be the same for him wherever he went in Australia. So what was the point of moving? And you can see that in that quote. That's what he means by saying, you know, simply wealth is the one to determine. If I don't have wealth, everywhere is live the same. The quote's also indicative of Kual's experience of the lack of employment pathways in the various areas that he's lived, including rural town where he currently lives, and a certain resignation about blocked social mobility. Racial discrimination is also part of this. He feels that he's been blocked when he's gone for other kinds of less menial jobs, and that there is extensive, partially hidden racism in rural town and other places. He has other skills that are not recognised. Afshan, a young woman, 23 years old, from Afghanistan, from a refugee background, had lived in rural town since childhood, recognised the lack of both economic and social opportunities there, and also how gender and patriarchal relations structured her opportunities. And she expected to move once she married because her husband, her future husband, was likely to want to move elsewhere for work. Women in her situation expected mobility as a normal part of their life course related to economic opportunities. And yet, viewing her spatial mobility as successful, since potentially leading to social mobility, would, on the other hand, neglect the fact that her preference would be to remain in rural town due to the ethno-religious community that she lives in there. And she reflects in the quote on the slide on the negative social consequences of living in places with a less supportive ethno-religious community, where she reflects upon the kinds of things that other people have said to her in very often. You can read that quote for yourselves. Now, at the same time, Afshan also acknowledged the limitations of belonging in rural town and the presence of racism. She was sure that being Muslim limited job opportunities, and to quote from her again, the quote's not on the slide, some companies, I think, they tend to be a bit biased about it, thinking, what, maybe she's wearing a scarf. What if she made the other customers uncomfortable? From her, as well as other statements, it was clear that patterns of discrimination and exploitation contributed to blocked socioeconomic mobility. Resignation, at least for now, to a low socioeconomic position, even for refugees from professional and highly educated backgrounds, can result from personal histories intersecting with social positioning, traumatic life experiences related to refugee experience, and positioning in ethno-racial religious hierarchies within Australia and within a rural town also links to spatial immobility, with ongoing exploitation in flexible, low-paying casual labour for those whose skills and previous work experiences remain unrecognised. Selma, the last person on this slide, aged in her late 40s, a humanitarian migrant from Iraq who had, after 16 years in Australia, established a successful career in a different field to her previous profession, thus achieving a form of horizontal economic mobility, explained that many men from Iraqi backgrounds no longer expected an improvement in their economic and professional positions in Australia and had their eyes firmly fixed on the past and their home country. And you've probably already read that quote, but that's what she's talking about there, about so many men from the town who just stay there and just do some casual work. Next slide, please, Martina. The interview quotes that I've just shown show that neither staying in a place or moving on can be easily interpreted as either settlement success or failure, which is a point that Heidi made before, and there's parallels with what we're saying here. Attention to Kual's, Afshan's and Selma's individual reflections on mobility suggests that the relationships between spatial and social mobility are complex. We know from research on attraction to regional areas that movements to regional areas are shaped by a multitude of factors, including but extending beyond employment opportunities such as family connections, affordable housing, a rural lifestyle that suits raising children, and so on, and finding your way in society, as I think Heidi was talking about, in a small place. Now, our research shows that movements away from regional towns need to be understood in the context of people's life courses and family circumstances, their experiences in communities and in local labour markets. Afshan, for example, stressed this lack of opportunities for young Afghan background men and women, resulting in strong desires for many to leave as soon as they could do so. Most importantly, it shows that staying on in a rural town should not be misunderstood as successful regional settlement necessarily, though of course it could be. On the contrary, our examples demonstrate that staying on can indeed be a sign of resignation to blocked social mobility. The very fact that low entry threshold employment opportunities are available, where former refugees partly compete with transient workers such as backpackers, is not a sign that regional settlement policies are necessarily successful. And yet this is only clear when the very potential of social mobility is explicitly viewed as part of the picture of refugee settlement. Next slide, please, Martina. I'm coming to the end now. As another man from a Congolese refugee background interviewed in the same town but for an earlier project commented when thinking about the celebration of the town as a welcoming multicultural place, to paraphrase the quote that's on the slide, the local council was all for celebrating the cultures of refugees and other migrants and including them that way through local celebrations where there were dances and cultural displays. But when it came to employment, it was a whole different story. This was where the purported multiculturalism and social inclusion of the town really fell flat. There was no passion on the part of the local council to think about economic development in relation to former refugees. He also felt that there was no real interest in and commitment to drawing on the accumulated knowledge and skills of former refugees. These just seemed irrelevant in the local regional context. And several refugee background participants commented that when they went for jobs, their previous experiences in pre-migration countries were deemed irrelevant compared to local experience. Next slide, final slide. So in conclusion, the success of regional settlement must be assessed in a multifaceted way. The sustainability of regional settlement policies will depend on recognising that the important role of former refugees' hopes, needs and aspirations, as well as their rights and the unintended human costs and consequences of quick fixes primarily focused on matching people with local labour shortages. The second point is that the absence of viable employment pathways for economically, socially, culturally and racially vulnerable former refugees undermines the regional settlement project. And the final point, as I'm running out of time, is that refugees' status as cultural or social others shapes the experience of social mobility in distinctive ways. The racial hierarchies that they encounter, obviously not only in regional locations, are a major shaping force in their multifaceted settlement experiences. So thank you. We've got slides with the references and our papers. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much, Martina and Anthony. It was really interesting and really makes us rethink how we see mobility, especially when it comes to retention. It's not always necessarily a rosy picture when it comes to people staying in a place. Okay, so it's my turn to present. I'll share this and fingers crossed everything works. Okay, so I don't know if you can see my notes, but you know, it is what it is. So just really, yeah, really glad to be presenting this today. So I'm going to be presenting this research on the mobilities of humanitarian migrants in the Limestone Coast, and I'm doing this on behalf of my colleagues Golebiowska and Rung. I'd also like to acknowledge the role that my former colleagues Kelly McDougall and Helen Berry played in this project when we did multiple trips to Limestone Coast quite a while ago. So just an outline of what I'm going to go through today. I'm going to start by setting the scene. I'll start with some quick stats to highlight the role of international migration in regional Australia, and then just using a combination of census data and some of the findings that we did, we'll start looking at what's been happening in the Limestone Coast. And then I'll just end with a quick summary discussion and also some of the next steps where I think are areas that might be worth exploring. So just this table here, I think goes without saying that Australia is very much a migrant country. Nearly 50% of us are either migrants or a child of a migrant. If you look at the table here, the top row really does show that things haven't really changed with the overseas-born population continuing to settle in major capital cities. If you look at the second row, rest of state, which is regional Australia, the proportion of the overseas-born settling in the regions has declined in the last 3 census periods. But despite this, the role of international migration is still quite critical. Again, as Alison said earlier, regions are not homogenous, so it's not like all regions are suffering a decline. Some are growing and really attracting and retaining international migrants. But if you look at regional Australia as a whole, it is typically characterized by aging, youth migration, depopulation. And if you look at net migration figures to Australia between 2011 to 2016, the chart shows that Australia as a whole sustains losses in the young age group. So we're looking at ages between 10 to 29 years old. And this is, the red line here is the line for the Australian-born population. And what we see is that the V shape is a deficit in those age groups. But the role of the overseas population is actually quite important in offsetting this loss. So the green line here that we see is actually, in those very age groups that we're talking about, we actually see a gain. And so without the overseas-born population, and the blue line coming up here is the total population, that V shape that we see, where we do see a negative net migration, in those age groups of 10 to 29, that V-shaped deficit will be much more exaggerated without the overseas-born population. And so we can try and boost the population and workforce of regional Australia through programs like the state-specific regional migration schemes, through skilled migration, and some others like Martina pointed out earlier in the slides with working holiday makers and so on. And I think sometimes, for quite a while, I've always felt that regional the resettlement of refugees in regional Australia is sometimes seen as a poorer cousin when we look at international migrants going to the regions, although this, I think, increasingly has been getting more and more attention. Since 2005, if you look at the chart, the identifying and developing regional locations for settlement started, and from 2005 to 2013, the proportion doubled from about 8% to over 16%. But since 2013, what we've also seen is that from over 16% in 2013, that has again more than doubled to almost 39% in 2019-2020. So the target of resettling new refugees, settling 50%, that was announced in 2019. That's something I think can be achievable if we can sustain this sort of momentum. So now turning to the Limestone Coast case study. So we did this in 2014. It was focused in 4 local government areas: Grant LGA, Mount Gambier LGA, Naracoorte Lucindale LGA, and also Tatiara LGA. Now, the main towns in this study were Mount Gambier, Naracoorte, and Bordertown. Now, not all towns were planned. So Mount Gambier was a planned settlement location, and Naracoorte town in Naracoorte Lucindale LGA was unplanned, and Bordertown in Tatiara was unplanned as well. So for this project, we interviewed about 80 people. 40 were from state government, local government, council, community stakeholders, volunteers, and the remaining 40 were refugees who were residing in across these various towns. So looking at the population change in Limestone Coast, in this table, we can see that between 3 census periods from 2006 to 2016, there was a general increase of the overseas-born population in each LGA. I just want to draw attention to Naracoorte Lucindale, so Naracoorte town and Bordertown. So Bordertown is based in Tatiara LGA. Tatiara had a gain of 195 people that were born overseas, but a loss of 653. So it wasn't able to offset fully, but without the overseas-born population, the overall population would have declined further. In contrast, Naracoorte had a loss of 250 Australians or Australian-born, but they gained 513 overseas-born people. So they did offset that loss in population. So just focusing on humanitarian migrants, we can see that in the Limestone Coast region, the key groups or refugees from a few key countries are quite significant. So like Afghanistan, Myanmar, Thailand, and along a range of African nations like Republic of Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, etc. And the growth has been quite dramatic in a short space of time. But what we can see from the census data is how being a planned settlement location or an unplanned settlement location can actually play a part in who settles where. So the unplanned settlement locations like Naracoorte and border town, we see that those from Afghanistan were actually quite significant. They had a significant presence in these towns. In contrast, Mount Gambier here, what you can see is actually, yes, Myanmar and Thailand were quite significant, but you also could see a broader range of countries of refugees residing in Mount Gambier. Now, just drawing your attention back to Naracoorte. So Naracoorte in particular has one of the highest proportion of the Afghan-born population. Actually, it has the highest proportion, not one of the, has the highest proportion of the Afghan-born across all South Australian LGAs. And if we look at a proportion of the Afghan-born, proportion of the overseas-born population, nearly 20% of the overseas-born population, and this includes people that are born in the UK and wherever, were from Afghanistan. So 1 in every 5 overseas-born persons in Naracoorte was from Afghanistan. So that's very significant, especially when you consider back in 2006, there was hardly any Afghan-born people in Naracoorte town. So how did all this start? And we found in our fieldwork, and this is an interview that we did with a state government official, and he said about 3 years ago, so this was back in 2014, the quote, so about 3 years ago, 2011 thereabouts, there was an explosion of Afghans, about 200 who moved into Naracoorte. And about 6 months ago, at the point of the interview, a similar pattern repeated in border town, where 150 to 170 Afghans moved into the town. And the understanding was that a lot of them had previously were previously residing in Adelaide or Melbourne. And so what we can see here is that the growth can be quite rapid in a short space of time, like, you know, kind of overnight, really, considering in this context. But also what we see is that we have a particular group of migrants who are willing to relocate to regional locations on their own accord outside of any formal policy setting. And the factors influencing their mobility mostly related to opportunities that were facilitated by social networks and obviously pursuing employment. But it also started, and this story was repeated to this government stakeholder quite a few times, that there were 2 Afghan men about 6 or 7 years ago that started up some subcontracting businesses in one of their contracts, servicing what is quite a large wine growing and horticultural region. And that just kind of grew and grew. And what happened was they were able to tap into their networks and get a lot of people from Afghan backgrounds to come and work for them. So next we'll go through the census data and show the types of the occupations that people engage in. But firstly, what I want to talk about here is the mobility patterns of the refugees that were interviewed in each town. You can see in Mount Gambier right here, the majority of them had Mount Gambier as their first place of settlement, which highlights the planned settlement nature of this place. Whereas in border town here and for Naracoorte, we had more people who had lived somewhere else prior to them living in border town or Naracoorte. Some had lived in 3 or more places as well. So I think what this does is serves to highlight the international migration, the internal migration patterns of refugees, and why we need to understand the secondary mobility behavior of refugees, but also maybe hypermobility too. So in this table here, we try to map out some of these routes, and some of the Afghan migrants that we spoke to, simply moved from a capital city like Adelaide to Naracoorte, Adelaide to border town, Perth to Naracoorte. But for others, they actually had lived and worked or just traveled through 2 or 3 different states as well. And really interesting that the role of networks really jumped out at me when I interviewed someone where they recounted a story of an Afghan person who was still on Christmas Island and had heard about Naracoorte even before coming to South Australia. Now, so looking at some of the social demographic indicators, this is the age-sex structure of the Afghan-born in Naracoorte and Lucindale. Now, this is in numbers, so it's not percentages, and this is from the census. And you can see how there's a real imbalance where there's so many males living living in Naracoorte compared to females. And so there's a real imbalance there. And these indicators kind of do play out when you look through different things. So marital status here. So I compared the proportion of the Afghan-born population in Naracoorte in blue and border town or Tatiara LGA in green versus Metro Adelaide LGAs. And you can see there's a much higher proportion who are married compared to those in Adelaide. And who do they live with? So looking at household composition, the vast majority of those in Naracoorte and Lucindale, Naracoorte town and border town, living with non-family members compared to those in Adelaide. And it's really interesting because that doesn't quite connect with the picture of the marital status, but also with the fact that so many men living in Naracoorte as well. But this relates to the fact that a lot of the people that were interviewed were single men. Like they were married, but they were just separated from the family and their children who were still being processed overseas at the time of the interview. And the census data, all these demographic and social indicators are showing out that what is happening in that instance. When we looked at education, a much higher proportion of the Afghan population did not go to school. In Naracoorte and border town compared to those in Adelaide. English language proficiency, higher proportions again do not speak English, who spoke English not well, and border town in particular was much higher. 40% spoke English not at all, and that is in contrast with those in Naracoorte, about 12%, and Adelaide 11%. So that's very stark. Employment presents a pretty good picture. 56% in Naracoorte were working full-time, about 78% in border town were working full-time, much higher than in Adelaide. In terms of where they were working, this is where it is quite concentrated in both towns. In Naracoorte, about 68%, nearly 69% were working agriculture, forestry and fishing, and in border town in manufacturing, and Adelaide as a whole just a much more even spread, wider distribution across all the different sectors. In terms of occupation at the 1-digit level, most of them, not shown here, most of them were working, the vast majority in these two towns were working as labourers. But in terms of occupation at the 4-digit level, over 50% in Naracoorte were crop farm workers, about 46% in border town were meat, poultry and seafood processing workers. You combine that with meat boners, slicers and slaughterers, you can tell that a lot of the Afghan population or people in border town were at the meatworks, and crop farmers as well in Naracoorte. Now, retention. So focusing on the towns in our study, we look at the retention rates between 2011 and 2016. So skilled migrants are here on the left, and refugees or humanitarian migrants on the right. And you can see in a 5-year period, skilled migrants, only 37% remain in Naracoorte, 38% in border town, and a little bit higher in Mount Gambier, 54%. In contrast with refugees who displayed a higher propensity to still be there in the 5-year period. 61% were still in Naracoorte, 78, so pretty high, still in Mount Gambier. Now the Tatiara numbers are a bit skewed because the numbers that we put up were quite small and the percentages don't end up to 100%. But overall, I think what we can see here is an overall trend of a higher or better retention of refugees than skilled migrants in this region. So just to summarize, so we see a lot of mobility happening outside of the planned settlement framework. And this is a good thing because it is a challenging policy arena when we try to attract and retain migrants in regional Australia. Now, the regions are not homogenous and neither are the refugees settling there. We can see differences in across the 3 towns in the Limestone Coast. The characteristics are different as well. Education, a lot of them are working low skilled hard labor, but then again, the sectors that they work in are different across the 2 towns. English language proficiency can be different, are generally low and can be different across towns as well. Labor market segmentation, very niche jobs that they're working in. Now, there's some additional data I left out. which relates to whether the Afghan born that we looked at were onshore applicants or primary applicants. So a lot of them were primary applicants in Naracoorte and Bordertown. Very, very small percentages were secondary applicants, which means their family members were not there. In contrast with Mount Gambier, which is a planned settlement location, smaller numbers were primary, larger percentages secondary. So that planned settlement process had families coming through together as a unit. Also, onshore, which means if you were onshore visa holder, you arrived by boat, so maritime arrivals. And in Bordertown and Naracoorte, the vast majority were onshore visa holders. Whereas in Mount Gambier, which is a planned settlement program, literally 100% were offshore. So they were processed overseas before they were directly resettled in Mount Gambier. So I think I've got to end now because it's 16 minutes and I shouldn't take advantage of my role as chair. So I think a lot of what we can do, we try to conceptualize our work and the migration experiences of refugees in regional towns. We draw on the work of Dorothy Smith by looking at how these mobilities are coordinated by mediating texts like visas and boss texts, which are governing frames positioned at the top of a hierarchy of texts. So hopefully, when we write this paper, we can theorize how people's experiences and mobilities with things like the asylum seeking process are shaped through these textually mediated social relations. Future research directions, challenges, we can talk about this in the Q&A. I think migration over the life course, yes, good retention rates for 5 years over the long term. I suspect we might not see the same levels of retention. Impact of COVID-19, something that we've got to address as well with people being priced out in inner regional areas too. Okay, I'll stop. I'll keep quiet now. Thank you for listening.